And let's start by getting to know who's here. And I attended a session, was it last summer or so? This is part of the Achieving the Dream conference. And one of the folks introduced it in a very different way. So I want you to share your name and then tell me where you're from. And so the way that he introduced where you're from, it's not, you can choose, right? Depending on where you are at today, what you identify today, you can be from a cultural group, right? Which people like to think right away, but you can be from a work group. You can be from a location, right? I'm from ECC, for instance, if that's where your headspace is, right? If that's what you identify today, right? Because from day to day, what is more prevalent to you could change. And so what's prevalent to you today? And so just your name, what position you work in or what discipline you work in, and then where you're from. And we'll just do kind of the popcorn idea. So anybody can go. So if I'll get it started and then somebody else can jump in. So I'm Manuel Salgado from the psychology department. Many of you know I've been in, I worked in counseling for many years before transitioning to psychology. And I'm from social justice right now. That's my headspace right now. I'm an advocate for social justice, and I've been thinking about these issues primarily related to undocumented students. So that's where I'm at right now. Next.
Yeah, I can jump in real quick. Hey, everybody, Tyler Rager, Director of CEDAL on campus, teaching research backgrounds, primarily literature and composition. Where I'm from, that's a good question. I like the way that you set that up, Manuel. So I'll share, I grew up in relatively small town, Southeast Missouri, but I've lived in Chicago suburbs and Pennsylvania all over the place for the last decade or so. Also coming from currently this week, a lot of coordination and administrator mind in terms of setting up this conference and coordinating things. So coming from sort of that space, but very much looking forward to being a participant, soaking a lot in from this session too. In popcorn style, I'm going to suggest somebody go next. So I'm going to ask Betsy, would you go next for us?
Okay, I'm Betsy Holmer. I'm part of the physical therapist assistant program. I'm probably the oldest member in this group and that group, though I will lie about my age. I left clinical practice during the height of the pandemic. So I'm teaching part-time and then looking towards getting out of caregiver role for senior parents and what to do with my future, whether it's fully into education or I have a big interest in pro bono work.
You choose somebody to go next?
Sure, Angelica.
Hello, my name is Angelica Stachnik, and I teach in the medical imaging department. I'm the clinical coordinator of the radiography program. And where am I from? It varies almost hourly. I'm laughing because it's true. I am pretty much all over the place. I don't know if I can really settle on one thing, but I think the biggest part of where I'm from is definitely my profession and my position here at ECC. A lot of things revolve around that. And I will pick Liddy.
Hi, I'm Liddy Hope. I'm a faculty in human services, and I am actually from Miami, which is probably not something anybody in here knows. And I am very much feeling it right now. My DNA does not do well with this cold weather. And I also live in a very small town right now, which is new to me in the past 3 years. And my Miami Metro blood is like, no, we don't know how to do this. So that's very much where I am today. Love this, Manny.
Choose somebody, Liddy.
Stacy.
Hi, everyone. I'm Stacy Shaw, distance learning librarian and faculty. And when you said where you're from, right away popped in my head, California. So I was like, oh, that must be really important to me. And also probably for similar reasons, Lydia's saying that I miss warm weather. But also I feel very much from ECC right now, and also very much from equity work right now. It also feels really important to me. And I will pass it. How about Anna Marie?
Thanks, Stacy. My name is Anna Marie Chopin. I serve as the Assistant Vice President of Teaching, Learning, and Student Development here at ECC. I am from, oops, sorry, I have problems with my video. I am from Chicago. I am a city girl through and through, even though the past 20 years I have lived out here. And the space that I am from right now is really learning. I'm in a doctoral program. I'm doing a lot of exciting stuff here at ECC. So I think learning is the space that I approach things from now.
You can choose someone.
Yeah, I'm sorry. I totally see not learning, did not follow the rules. James.
I'm Jim Gazaldo. This is my first semester. I'm in the Culinary and Hospitality Arts Department, as you can tell from my coat. And if I am within the Chicago metro area, I'm from St. Charles. If I'm outside of the Chicago metro area, I'm from Chicago. And I want to hear more about the Army background, so Ellen can go.
I don't think maybe she.
Sorry, I'm coming directly from another meeting, so I'm still kind of getting my act together here, but I really appreciate the way you asked the question, because I grew up with a father who was in the military, and that meant that we moved every year to 2 years, my entire childhood. I did 6th grade in one school, 7th in another, 8th in another, 9th in another, 10th in another. So I can never answer the question, where are you from? So right now I'm going to go with I'm an Army brat. And that's my answer. And I teach in English as a second language. And I'm listening, but I'm going to turn my camera and my mic back off for a little bit.
Thank you. So I think we have Reyes Estrada. Or Kathleen, right? Kathleen, you haven't.
Good afternoon. My name is Kathleen DeMars, and like Jim, it's my first semester here at ECC. I teach over in Building K in the Adult Basic Education Center. I am from New York today. My family is from there. It's where I grew up. I am a Northeast girl through and through, even though I've lived in the Midwest since 2004 or 5. But I'm an only child, and my dad's health hasn't been so great lately. So I am from New York. That is where my head is.
Okay, thank you. Reyes Estrada is the name there. If you're available, speak now or forever hold your peace. Okay, maybe they're not ready. All right, so thank you for coming. Here's the, let me share my screen. Let me set this up. Okay. At home, this setup of screens and stuff comes much easier than at work. So I have to spend a little bit of time making sure I got the chat visible, I got the faces visible. We're good, I think, right? So here's a plan. We are going to start talking about learning. Obviously, we all have our own definition for learning. And so we're going to, just to lay the foundation for what I'm talking about learning, we're going to discuss that initially. And then we're going to talk about the role of cognition, right? Specifically memory in the learning process. And then dive into those specific tools or practices, retrieval practice and spacing practices, and what are some of the benefits in that? What are some of the research? What is the research saying about that? And then classroom application. I'll share some of my ideas, and then hopefully you all can share your ideas, because I think all of us are doing that type of practice. It's just, I'm hoping that today you'll have a sense to be more intentional about how you apply that practice in your own area. So let's start in this way. Let's do a chat blast. That's something I also learned early or late last year. It was pretty cool. So a chat blast, you're going to write something in the chat and then wait until I say go, and you press enter when I say go. And just write down, when you hear the word learning, what's the word that is associated with learning to you? Okay, go ahead. Ooh, vitality. That's a big word. Understanding, acquire knowledge, internalizing knowledge, trying. Oh, lifelong. Okay. Now, think about, and this is, I think, critical, right? To be able to understand the practice of learning is, how did you learn when you were an undergrad? So take yourself back to your first or second year of undergrad. You're coming in, obviously a new environment, perhaps a new culture, perhaps a new challenge to you. At that time and at that space, what did you think worked for you? How did you make learning work for you in that space? And this one, we'll just share out. If you have something that you would want to share out with somebody, with all of us, just open your mic and share it out. What came up when you thought about that?
I learned how to take notes and the impact that writing with my hand had on my retention of information. I also learned how to ask questions, whether it was during class or whether it was afterwards, one-on-one with the instructor.
Yeah. Others?
I didn't learn my freshman and sophomore year. And I still have some regret over that, because I missed a lot of opportunities, but I just I didn't think about it. I was very focused on other things. I was just going to college because I was supposed to. I found it all very interesting. And I could kind of skate by and do okay without really focusing on it. But it really wasn't until grad school that I learned some strategies.
Others? What came up for others?
Similar to Liddy, I think my freshman year of my undergraduate was less learning about academics, and it was more of a cultural shift for me. I'm a first generation college student. And I was always considered a bright kid, and I didn't really have to work hard in high school. And, my parents thought I got into a great college. They're like, the rest will play itself out. And I just was not prepared for the level of competitiveness. It was definitely a culture shock for me.
Yeah, thank you for sharing.
I'll mention, for me, one of the first things that came to mind is kind of unlearning things my first couple of years. Like, I guess similar to Anne Marie, thinking I had several things kind of figured out within sort of my discipline and my areas of study, and recognizing that, I only had a pretty small picture of where things might go. And so I feel like I had to unlearn a lot of the ideas I had that were kind of set in stone, and figure out how to change my mind about concepts and ideas, and how to sort of begin to question more, to connect to what Kathleen was sharing, how to kind of contribute to a conversation, how to sort of build a conversation, is something I had to figure out.
Yeah, thank you. Anyone else that would like to share?
Yeah, I'll jump in. Since my field's very hands-on. For me, it was doing and experiencing that was brought about learning.
Okay. Yeah, so really getting your hands on something and practicing it. Good. So thank you for that. The reason I'm asking that question is very much like Liddy, and no wonder we get along, Liddy. I didn't learn, and I tell this story all the time to my students. Now I thought I was learning. That's the other thing, right? I was getting good grades, right? But I learned, that's the lesson I learned in high school, right? I learned how to follow instructions so that I can get the grade that I needed to pass the class. That I learned. But if you ask me about the subject matter that I was supposed to learn, or Jim, like you said, doing something, I would look at you with a confused and very fuzzy, puzzled look, because I probably captured 1/4% of what I was supposed to capture, right? So I wasn't retaining information. And so when we look at learning, right, what do we mean? What do we want our students to learn, right? When we say actually learning outcomes, do we want them? And this is, you'll recognize this is Bloom's taxonomy, right? Remember, do we want them to remember something and just be able to document it later or regurgitate it at a later time, right? Do we really want them to understand a process or the way to do things? Do we want them to apply it somehow in another space, or analyze it, or evaluate, or create it? And I'm going to show you, I know my assumption is that most of you are familiar with the Bloom's taxonomy, but I'm going to show you this quick video. This is just a 5-minute little video that talks about sort of the trajectory of Bloom's taxonomy and some of the changes that happened, because it's important to understand what are we seeking to do with learning, right? And for me, that was a very important lesson. I still consider myself a young teaching professional. I've only been teaching for about 5 years. And so I'm still learning in this space, but a very significant lesson was asking myself that question. Not only what I want my students to learn, but what am I doing so that my students can learn that piece of information? So here it is.
Most educators are familiar with Bloom's taxonomy, a model that classifies different levels of human cognition in thinking, learning, and understanding. As a teacher, you've likely used this taxonomy to guide the development of curriculum, assessments, and instructional strategies. But how is this model affected in an age of digital technology, and how might it influence your instructional design? Let's take a step back. Bloom's taxonomy was created in the 1950s by educational psychologist Benjamin Bloom and his colleagues. The 3 lower levels, knowledge, comprehension, and application, are more basic levels of cognition, also called lower order thinking skills. This would include concrete thinking, memorization, and understanding. The 3 upper levels, analysis, synthesis, and evaluation, referred to as higher order thinking skills, include abstract, critical, metacognitive, and creative thinking. Some have likened the model to a mountain or a stairway, where teachers set learning objectives and design learning experiences to guide students to higher levels of thinking. The taxonomy has become an important model for structuring students' learning processes. In the 1990s, Bloom's taxonomy was updated by a group led by David Krathwohl, one of the original authors, and Lauren Anderson, a former student of Bloom's. To make the model relevant to 21st century learning, one of their main changes was updating the nouns associated with each level to action-oriented verbs. This differentiation positions thinking as an action-based process rather than one of passive acquisition. For example, knowledge was replaced with remember, analysis was changed to analyze, and so on. They also reordered the last 2 steps. Evaluation, which was previously at the top, was moved down, and creating, formerly synthesis, was moved to the top. With this framing, educators have several different verbs, questions, and instructional strategies associated with each level. In recent years, there have been many iterations and metaphors for Bloom's taxonomy, including an orange, where the 6 levels are distributed more equally, moving cogs, representing an interworking system in which creation is dependent upon all of the other aspects, or a flipped pyramid illustrating an emphasis on higher order thinking skills. But in thinking about how technology affects this model, consider it as Bloom's digital taxonomy. This updated version aims to expand upon the skills associated with each level as technology becomes a more ingrained and essential part of learning. For instance, some propose that new action verbs can be applied within each level. Let's take a look at creating, in which learners are designing, inventing, and constructing a piece of work that shows what they know. One could add new digital verbs to creating, like blog, remix, or program. These verbs refer to possible learning activities that incorporate digital technologies in which students are creating. Adding digital verbs to the taxonomy also promotes 21st century skills like communication, collaboration, creativity, and critical thinking. Others have taken the 6 levels of the taxonomy and aligned them with technology tools that help foster each level. For example, as a teacher, you can think about how to integrate apps and websites that help students remember content, like flashcards or drill and practice tools. There are tools that help students analyze and make sense of content, like reading charts, graphs, or mind maps. Or you can think about what tools support student creation, like producing, podcasting, blogging, coding, editing, and more. With these examples, the focus should not necessarily be on the tools themselves, but on how the tools can be vehicles in transforming student thinking at different levels. So, as you weave technology into your teaching, ask yourself, how can the tools you use support different cognitive levels? Which tools help you address lower order thinking skills? And which can help challenge students' higher order thinking skills? Consider how Bloom's digital taxonomy can help you identify ways to design technology-rich learning experiences for your students.
So today, I'm going to focus more on the lower order cognition, right? That foundation that we want students to be able to understand and to remember, right? And to apply. Right? So one of the key aspects of learning is memory, right? We want students, if we want students to learn, right, we need to be very conscious about this process of learning. And it begins with this lower order thinking outcomes of understanding the process in which memory or remembering happens. So when we look at the memory process, and this is what is, it's almost funny when I bring this up in class, is the encoding process, right? Is the attention process. So memory is a single term, but it applies to a number of different abilities. And one of them, right, is this beginning process of encoding. And so we begin with encoding information, which is mostly perceiving it and relating it to past knowledge. Then we go through a storage process, which is maintaining that information over time. And then retrieving it, right, is getting the information out, which is critical to the strategies that I'm going to talk about, because sometimes we spend way too much time on how to put information in, right, especially when we're studying, when students are studying, and not a lot of time on how to get information out, or if information is actually coming out or not, right? So the key to improving one's memory is to improve the processes of encoding. You've all, some researchers say that that 50% of the time our mind is wandering. And I always remember that when I'm in class, and I tell students this, right? I know that in our hour and 15 minutes in class, your mind wasn't even here, right? You were not fully present because of your wandering. Wandering happens, and it's normal. It's tough to maintain focus on one stimulus in your environment. And so that's why we have to be very cognizant of what type of strategies, how are we engaging students, how are we making it more active for them. So good encoding techniques include relating new information to what is already known, forming mental images, and creating associations among information that needs to be remembered. Those are the strongest forms of memory. If you can connect new information to old information, you have a much more likely to store it and be able to retrieve it later on. So when encoding, we can't remember everything. Our brains sort of pick and choose what we focus our attention on, right? This is selectivity. And I'm not sure, I have that picture in the slide. I'm not sure if you all recognize that picture or not, but this is a very classical experiment that did in psychology to prove how vulnerable our attention is, right? So the way that this works is they ask the participants of this research study to pay attention to the people wearing white shirts and to count how many passes of the basketball do these people in the white shirts make. And you have people with white shirts and then people with black shirts just moving all around in that space. And the people with white shirts are bouncing a basketball to each other as they're moving. And so participants are focusing their attention on movement of the white shirts. They're focusing their attention on the basketball. They're focusing their attention on where the basketball is moving. And in that process, as they're observing that, they have this person dressed in a gorilla suit pass right in the center of the screen and punch his chest and then move away from the screen. And what they found in this research is 1/3 to 50% of the students don't realize that gorilla actually passed in the screen. Right? They ask them later, first they ask them, well, how many basketball passes were done by these people in white shirts? And so they make a guess, and but then the real question is, did you see the gorilla, right? And that sort of tells us, right, our attention is vulnerable. Our attention is limited, right? We can't pay attention to many stimulus at one time. And so that's the importance sort of the encoding process, right? That we have to pay attention. How is it that we're encoding information? And then the storage is, how are we consolidating this information, right? What type of organization are we applying to that new information so that we can actually store it in a way that we can find it later on? So we sometimes construct past events as we remember with the aid of our memory traces, but also with current knowledge of what we think happened in the past. And this is what Elizabeth Loftus is a famous researcher, still a very pronounced researcher in false memories. And she talks about memory as a constructive and reconstructive process, right? It's not like we put information in and we store it like if it was some type of disk on a computer or memory on a computer, right? That when you go pull it out, it's exactly the same way you left it. Our memories are vulnerable to being reconstructed as we experience the world around us, right? And so how we're structuring that piece of information and that knowledge of information, how we're storing it with connecting it to old information is extremely important, right? For us to be able to keep it. And then the last piece of it is retrieval, right? It's just getting the information out. Like I said initially, many students spend a lot of time how to put information in, but they never test themselves to know if information can actually be pulled out. So here's something interesting with encoding, right? When we're talking about encoding, there's some, the self-referencing effect that was studied in psychology. Back in 1977, there was a researcher, Roger Cooper and Kirker, found that in some of the experiments that they made is that when recall is made self-reference, right? The question is about them, that last bullet point there, when is supposed to indicate whether the word describes you, when you reference it to something about you, it has just a superior amount of recall for that same word, right? And so it's very useful in the encoding task. So self-reference induces superior incidental recall compared to any other one, semantic or phonetic or structural recall. Right, so that's a very interesting study. And then somebody followed that study up in 1986. And they concluded that it really, self-referencing wasn't really making a memory stronger, or more durable. But however, what it was doing is helping the organization. Right? Remember, we were talking about the structure, the storage process, and how you have to organize information. So what they were saying in this study, they did a very similar study. They were asking participants to remember different types of words, and some were more structural, some were more semantic, some were more self-referenced. And what they found is that it was more the organization that was being strengthened, and not so much the memory itself. But nevertheless, if you organize something, right, when you're encoding, it's going to lead to a stronger trace of memory, which then you can pull out much more effectively. So here's just scoping out a little bit. I read, and by the way, let me share it now before I forget. I did make, in case you all are interested, I'm going to share a folder with all these resources that I'm sharing with you. So you can go in there and look at them on your own. I think if you take anything from this talk today, is those resources that you can look at later. So they're all there in that Google folder. And beginning with this one, this is the one that a few years ago really draw my attention, right? Dunlawski, 2013, did a research on best learning practices, right? So he was researching which of these practices actually lead to better recall of information. Right. And so he was looking at practice testing, which is retrieval practice. He was looking at distributive practice, which is spacing, and then all the other 10. And what he found among his research is that the top 2 were very effective in any context, any type of discipline that they were using, or any type of information, whether it was word matching, or if it was open responses. He was finding that practice testing and distributed practice were very effective. Now the others, I think, is 3 to 6. He named in his research like promising, like they have a promise, they can work in different contexts. But he concluded that the bottom 4 did not lead to better recall of information on their own, right? And so I started looking this up a little bit more, and specifically with retrieval practice, and started asking myself, yeah, this makes a lot of sense, right? We're using some of this information in our classes. And students, if you ask students, I've been asking students this for a long time. This is kind of my counseling hat in the classroom. I always ask them about their study strategies. And a lot of them, you wouldn't be surprised, right? 6 and 7 is very, very common among the study techniques that students use. And yet, according to this type of research, it doesn't really lead to very effective recall of information, right? Especially if you test them a week out, which you're going to see from the research, right? So I'm specifically just going to focus on, in the time that we have here, on retrieval practice and spacing practice. And I read this book, Powerful Teaching, that it's Pooja Agarwal and Patrice Bain in 2019 wrote this book that specifically concentrates on what we're talking about today, what actually leads to learning, what's actually effective for learning. And so when we talk about retrieval practice, she asked in that book, they talk about a focus group that she did with many teaching professionals. And she asked them, well, how would you define retrieval practice? What is retrieval practice for you? And these are some of the things that they said, right? So some said having to strain your memory in order to do something previously learned, or reaching into the recesses of your brain to grab knowledge that's stored there, or digging for information and bringing up the learning surface. So whenever you've encouraged students to do self-testing, or in class you've done like pop quizzes of some sort, that's retrieval practice, right? You're forcing them to remember something that they quote unquote learned, right? And that's what retrieval practice is. We try to do that in a form that is it's not high stakes. You're benefiting the process itself, the practice itself of recalling information, and not the outcome, right? And Pooja Agarwal says it really well. This is not an assessment practice. This is a learning practice, right? And if we start seeing it that way, right, these are some of the benefits that she lists in that book. I'll just quickly point number 3. This is, for me, a very easy and effective tool to identify gaps in learning. And I notice this all the time in my class. I do, so here's one of the techniques that I use. It's called dumping, right? You might have heard of this technique, or you might call it something different because you probably do it, but you call it something different. It's a technique that I teach students how to do, especially I tell them when they get into a habit of scheduling long study sessions that really are not effective, right? These 3 hours, 4 hours that they say, oh, I'm going to sit down and study. I tell them, please don't do that. But if you have to do that, add this strategy to your practice, right? Which is dumping. And so what that is let's say you spend time 15 minutes or 20 minutes reading something or reviewing some material. Stop after 20 minutes, at most 30 minutes, give yourself like a 5-minute break. And then when you come back, have a blank sheet of paper in front of you. And in that blank sheet of paper, what you end up writing down is, what do you remember from the 15, 20 minutes that you were studying or reading? Now, when I do that in class, right, I'm quote unquote lecturing, I'm doing a short lecture in class, and then I tell them, close your notes and your book and take out a scratch sheet of paper. And now just write down anything and everything that you remember from the last 20 minutes of lecture. And for me, what I find many times is either gaps in learning, right? How they remember what I was presenting, or that they were not paying attention, right? And it's not something for me. The reason I do that is so that they can understand in the last 20 minutes, whatever you were doing with your note-taking strategy, it didn't work, right? So you might have to change that strategy. And so it gives us that opportunity to help students identify their learning. And that's the other, the metacognitive part, right? Is that you help students learn about their learning process. These are some other benefits that she writes in the book, right? Improving students' mental organization, increases students' learning of related information. I noticed that after talking about attention and a few retrieval practices, students begin to change the way they take notes or the way they attend to what I'm saying. Recently, I noticed a student that it was one of those very active writers in your class. You've seen that when you're talking and you got a student that They have their head put down and they're writing intensively. And after a couple of sessions that I've done these dumping exercises, I noticed that the student is writing less and has their head towards me, and I can see them nodding, and that's what I recommend, right? I said, try to minimize your writing and try to see if you can attend to the information that I'm presenting. And so here's some of the evidence, right? And this is by no means exhaustive, but in 2015, right, Canna did a test between ungraded pop quizzes and graded pop quizzes, which was really interesting, right? She had a condition that was graded quizzes, a condition that was ungraded quizzes, and then no quiz condition at all. And what she found in that study was that ungraded pop quizzes do lead to higher cumulative grades in the final exam performance than using graded pop quizzes or using no quizzes at all. So if you're determining whether I should use pop quizzes that are graded or pop quizzes that are not graded, these ungraded pop quizzes are more effective to performance later on in a final exam. Ariel and Karpik in 2017, they did they were looking at self-regulated learning and retrieval practice. And they found that students, when using retrieval practice, and this is more in learning a new language, so they were testing whether students would learn new words in Lithuanian or not. And then they tested the difference in their performance after they had a group do self-testing. And the retrieval group recalled more translations than did the control group. And thus what they concluded in that experiment was that the retrieval practice enhanced performance, suggesting that students altered their self-regulated learning choices based on the instructions, right? So that's another piece of importance, right? Like I was saying, sometimes it's not for us to assess their performance, but it's for them to think about how they're learning. And there's a benefit there in that study. And then Smith and Karpik, they did a separate study that was looking at short answer questions, multiple choice questions, hybrid test, and the role of retrieval practice in learning to answer each of those type of questions. And what they found is when subjects practice retrieval after studying, they perform better on final assessment a week later relative to subjects who did not practice retrieval. So there's the key there that I like in this study, because a week later is extremely important, right? Because some of the studies that have studied with retrieval practice doesn't have a significant effect if you test it out just one day later, right, is what they found. But if you test out the effects of retrieval practice a week later or more, you see the true benefits of retrieval practice, right? If you want your students to hang on to information for longer than the next day or the test date, right, has tremendous benefits. Now, space practice, this is something that you obviously know. This is essentially not cramming, right? When we space out our studying practice. And I think conceptually, this is, obviously we all know what that is, but I think for us as teaching professionals, how do we apply that in our classes, right? Do we apply that in our classes, or do we unintentionally emphasize cramming for our students, right? Are you trying to cram a lot of information all at once, right? You're communicating to them, this is what I'm recommending, right? This is what the approach that I'm recommending. So I think that's the key with space practice, right? We know that it improves students' long-term teaching. We know that it has lasting learning over time, right? And it benefits a diverse students, right? From They've done studies from students in elementary years of schools, and they've done studies with medical students, and all the same, right? It's space practice. When we implement space practices, it makes a significant difference. Now, as obvious as that seems, right? When we were taking classes, I think all of us understood, some of us learned the hard way, like myself, that cramming doesn't really work, right? All of us that did those all-nighters in college, that doesn't really work for learning. But how do we translate to how we practice in class? Or do we practice that in class, right? Do we space out the material for them to learn? So the content that you presented in the first week of class, are you presenting it again in the 4th week of class or in the 8th week of class? Or is it done after the 1st week of class, right? And that's a lesson that I'm still learning, because the way that I structure my class, I only have a 3-chapter unit. So essentially, I do talk about that content in the 1st week of class through the 4th week of class, but then after that, I don't talk about it again. And so I have to think about, okay, I have to do something to present that material again, so that it can strengthen what they've actually learned. And there are other set of research that is out there, and I'm not going to go through all of them. I'm just looking at the time, and we're running short on time now, but these resources, this research is what I've shared with you. So if you want to look at each of these studies by themselves, they demonstrate, they provide evidence that spacing actually has an impact on learning. So I think this is the key piece, right? That many of you, and I want us to kind of consider some of these and perhaps talk about some of the strategies that you've used. Right? So one strategy is called index cards. And this is primarily when we were face-to-face. If you're going to do like a quiz, you would give an index cards to students that one had A, one had B, one had C, one had D. And then you ask a question and you give them options, right? A, B, C, D, and they just get to answer with their index card. The modern twist to that is kind of the online quizzes that we do now, right? Like Kahoot. I use Kahoot a lot. Other people use other apps or other sites for that type of quizzing, but it's the same thing, right? You're giving opportunity for students to think about an answer and answer it in an anonymous way. Exit tickets is another strategy. Is you give students a small slip of paper at the very beginning of class as students are entering the classroom, or before students leave the classroom, is the exit tickets. That includes question about the content learned in class. It could even be simple writing prompt, right? Another way that I've heard of this exercise is the 1-minute question. You've heard that, the 1-minute question you give at the end of the class, just very simple instructions. Tell me one thing that you learned, tell me one thing that is still confusing, tell me one thing that you would like to still be answered, right? Or information that still needs to be answered. Dumping exercise, I kind of talked about that already. The hook, the pretest before a particular unit. I haven't used this much. This was recommended through that book of Powerful Teaching, but it sounds like it could help, right? If at the beginning of the unit, you kind of pique their interest with a particular quiz or a pretest that is obviously not graded and not punitive at all, but at least it gets them thinking about what the chapter is going to be about or what the content that they're supposed to learn is going to be about. And then Agarwal and Bain talk about this big basket quizzes. And what they mean by this is a quiz that at the end of the week is end of the week quiz. It contains not only the questions from the daily quizzes throughout the week, but also questions from previous weeks. And this is a really good technique to add both the retrieval practice and the spacing, right? So with these big basket quizzes, you are able to ask about what they just learned that given week, but also add some questions about what they were supposed to learn like 2 weeks prior or 3 weeks prior, right? And see where their learning is at. And then drawing and metaphors. These I think are excellent. I'm still challenged to implement this in a psychology class, but I use this a lot like in learning about the brain. When we're learning about the brain, I ask students to draw me a metaphor of how the brain works after we finish with the unit. And so that makes them think about the different functions of the brain and their role of each of those functions in a different type of way. And many students use the computer as a metaphor. Some use a cell phone as a metaphor. But when you have students think about a drawing or a metaphor, they're recruiting different parts of the brain in order to produce that image. And that's very helpful for memory as well. So let me open it up to you all. Based on those practices, how are you applying that in your class so that others can benefit from that? Is there anything else besides those suggestions that I quickly gave? What else are you doing to help with retrieval practice or space practice in your class?
I tend to ask my students at the end of their class where their gaps or I think of their learning as like a piece of Swiss cheese and there are holes in it. And I ask them to self-reflect and think where are the holes in what we've talked about today. And I give them a quick reminder of the things we covered. And I say, where are the holes? Where do you feel you need more practice? And based on their responses, that's where our warm-up begins in the next class period.
Nice, I like that. Yeah. And is that like a large room discussion? So they just pop up and raise their hands?
Yeah, they just raise their hand. My classes aren't that large, yeah, they just raise their hand and let me know what they think they need a little more work with. And I try to phrase it not as like, what do we not get, but what do we need more practice with? Students are more willing to volunteer that they'd like to try something again or a little bit more than to say, I don't get it. So what can we use some more practice with? And that's where we start the next session.
Thank you, Kathleen, for sharing that. Any other ideas that popped up that you are already using? Ellen?
One of the things that I do with my classes is I tell them, all my classes are on Zoom, I'm entirely online. And I say that for every class, I need them to have something that's red and something that's green that they can hold. And then I ask them for red light, green light. So when I have either explained something or we've done something and I'll ask them, okay, how do you feel? Do you feel like green light, you're ready to go, or red light? No, we need to stay here a little longer. And then they just hold up whatever the thing is. So like, this is my green light.
Oh, cool.
And so then I can just look real quickly across the screen. If I'm seeing like a lot of green things, I know I'm okay. If I'm seeing a lot of red things, then I know I need to slow down. And sometimes it's a mix, and then, it's a judgment call. And sometimes the clock dictates, how long we stop at a red light. But it's worked really well. And because it's visual, and because it doesn't make anybody say anything, it works really well. And if they're not participating with their cameras, now that there are more reactions, they can give, a red or a green, and they've got lots of different reactions if they don't have a physical thing.
I was thinking about that. That might be a backwards way of saying turn on your camera too.
Yeah.
But you're right, if they can't. I'm glad that you give them that option, right, to use those other sources.
I am really not a stickler about cameras. For the first half of this presentation, I wasn't able to have my camera on. So I appreciate that from my students too. But it works really well. So it's kind of fun. And some of the students really get into it and they'll find like really weird red and green things to show, which is just kind of fun, it breaks up the monotony a little.
No, it does. I like that. And you make it a little bit personal, right? That's their personal space or personal item.
Mhm.
So unfortunately, I told you, Tyler, I didn't time this, and it was a little bit longer than I anticipated. So we are running out of time. So I hope that information is helpful. I gave you the resources that hopefully that can be even more helpful as you're thinking about how to apply these type of strategies in your class. But yeah, I'll stick around for another minute if you have questions. But other than that, thank you very much for coming, and have a good rest of your day.